Welcome back to another writing episode. Today, we are looking at one of the most useful and versatile text types, the blog. A blog can appear deceptively easy, but in an IB examination, simply sounding casual and adding a catchy title does not automatically produce a successful blog. You are still being assessed on sophisticated language, strong development of ideas, careful organization, audience awareness, appropriate tone, and recognizable text type conventions. So the objective is not simply to write something that looks like a blog. The objective is to write a blog that fulfills the particular communicative situation given in the prompt. At higher level, Paper 1 gives you 3 tasks. You select one task and then choose one of the text types offered for that task. Your response should be between 450 and 600 words. The paper lasts 1 hour and 30 minutes. There are 3 assessment criteria. Criterion A is language, worth 12 marks. Criterion B is message, also worth 12 marks. Criterion C is conceptual understanding, worth 6 marks. That means 18 of the 30 marks are directly connected with what you communicate and how appropriately you communicate it. Excellent grammar alone cannot rescue a response that misunderstands the audience, ignores part of the task, or uses the wrong kind of writing. Before learning the structure of a blog, therefore, learn the most important Paper 1 habit. Decode the prompt before you write. Identify 3 things immediately: context, audience, and purpose. Context means the situation in which you are writing. Audience means exactly who is expected to read your text. Purpose means what you want that audience to think, understand, feel, or do after reading it. Then identify the actions demanded by the question. A typical IB-style prompt does not merely say, "Write about volunteering." It places you in a situation and asks you to perform several communicative actions. For example, your school recently organized a weekend during which students volunteered with organizations in the local community. You took part and were surprised by how much you gained from the experience. You want to share what happened with other young people. Write a text in which you describe your experience, explain how it changed your view of volunteering, and encourage other young people to participate in similar activities. Notice how the task contains 3 clear actions. Describe your experience. Explain how it changed your perspective. Encourage others to become involved. The blog is an excellent choice because the intended audience is a relatively broad group of young readers. The writer is expected to share a personal experience, and the purpose includes both reflection and persuasion. A proposal would be much more appropriate if you were presenting formal recommendations to a school administration or organization. A formal letter would make more sense if you were addressing one specific person or institution. This leads us to the first important principle. Choose a blog when the task involves communicating with a wider online readership while still allowing the writer to have a recognizable personal voice. Blogs work particularly well when you need to share an experience, reflect on an issue, express an opinion, advise readers, raise awareness, persuade a community, or encourage discussion. They are less appropriate when the situation clearly requires confidential communication with one person, an objective investigation presented to an authority, detailed formal recommendations, or a spoken address delivered to a live audience. A blog is public, a diary is private. That difference matters. Imagine that you spent 3 days without your phone. A diary entry might say, "I honestly hated today. By lunchtime, I had already reached for my phone about 20 times. I felt ridiculous." The writer is essentially talking to themselves. A blog might say, "Could you survive 3 days without your phone? I thought I could. By lunchtime on day 1, however, I had already reached automatically for a device that was no longer in my pocket about 20 times." The experience is personal, but it has been shaped for an audience. That is one of the central characteristics of an effective blog. Personal experience is transformed into public communication. A blog is also different from a conventional article. An article may sound comparatively detached. Excessive smartphone use has become a growing concern among teenagers, particularly because of its possible effects on concentration and sleep. A blog can approach the same subject more personally. Until last weekend, I would have laughed at anyone who called me dependent on my phone. Then I switched it off for 72 hours. Both can contain serious ideas. The difference is largely in voice, relationship with the reader, and approach. A successful blog usually creates the impression that there is a real person behind the screen speaking directly to real readers. So what should an IB blog actually contain? Begin with a clear and engaging title. Avoid meaningless titles such as My Blog Technology Volunteering Environment. These identify a topic, but create almost no interest. A stronger title gives the reader a reason to continue. I switched off my phone for 72 hours. Here's what happened. The Saturday that changed my mind about volunteering. Our school throws away more than food traveling alone. Taught me something. No classroom could. Would you give up fast fashion for a month? A title can signal personal experience, introduce a conflict, raise a question, or promise a discovery. Then move into your opening. An effective blog opening usually performs several jobs very quickly. It attracts attention. It establishes the topic. It creates the writer's voice. And it begins building a relationship with the reader. Consider this opening. Have you ever signed up for something simply because your friend persuaded you to? That is exactly how I ended up spending last Saturday sorting food donations at our local community center. I expected 6 tedious hours of moving boxes. Instead, I left wondering why I had waited so long to volunteer. In only a few sentences, we have a question addressed directly to the reader, personal context, a specific experience, and a change in perspective. Most importantly, the opening is connected directly to the task. Do not spend 80 words warming up before addressing the question. Every paragraph should help fulfill the task. Once the situation has been introduced, develop the main ideas in a logical sequence. For an experience-based blog, a useful progression is what happened, what you initially thought or felt, what you discovered, why the experience mattered, and what the reader should take from it. For an issue-based blog, the progression might instead be introduce the problem, show why it matters, give an example, consider consequences, suggest changes, and invite readers to respond or act. Do not treat those as rigid templates. Structure must follow purpose. Now consider the volunteering prompt again. A weak response might write one paragraph describing the event, one sentence saying it was useful, and then spend the rest of the blog telling everyone to volunteer. That would technically touch all 3 instructions, but it would not fully develop them. Criterion B rewards developed ideas. A reliable way to develop an idea is to move from claim to explanation to example to significance. Suppose your claim is, volunteering changed the way I saw loneliness among elderly people. Develop it. Before that weekend, I assumed that the volunteers at the center were mainly there to deliver meals. I quickly discovered that the conversation often mattered just as much as the food. One woman kept us at her door for nearly 15 minutes because, as she eventually admitted, we were the first people she had spoken to all day. That moment changed my understanding of community service. Helping someone does not always require money, specialist knowledge, or heroic sacrifice. Sometimes it simply requires time. That is development. The paragraph does not merely state that volunteering is valuable. It explains why, illustrates the point concretely, and draws a broader conclusion from the experience. This is exactly the kind of depth you want throughout a higher-level response. Now let us look at audience. Because one of the most common mistakes in blog writing is assuming that every blog should sound equally informal. It should not. The appropriate register depends on the readers. Imagine 3 blogs discussing exactly the same subject, reducing food waste. The first is written for teenagers on a student lifestyle website. You might write, "Be honest. How many times have you bought lunch, decided you weren't really hungry and thrown half of it away? I had never thought much about it either. Until our environmental club weighed one day's leftovers." The language is conversational. Contractions are natural. "Be honest" speaks directly to the reader. The tone assumes a degree of familiarity. Now imagine that you are writing for the entire school community, including students, teachers, and parents. The approach changes. Most of us would probably describe our school as environmentally conscious. Yet one afternoon beside the cafeteria bins made me question how accurate that description really is. In a single lunch period, perfectly edible food filled several containers. If we want sustainability to become more than a slogan, food waste is an obvious place to begin. The writer remains present, but the register becomes more measured. The inclusive "we" is useful because the audience is a community rather than a friendship group. Now imagine a sustainability blog intended for a broad adult readership. You might write, "Food waste is easy to discuss as an abstract environmental problem. It becomes far harder to ignore when you actually see the volume produced by one relatively small institution in less than an hour. After observing lunchtime waste at a local school, I became convinced that some of the simplest environmental changes are also among the most achievable." The tone is still accessible, but noticeably more controlled and analytical. The lesson is simple. Blog does not equal very informal. A blog can range from informal to semi-formal and sometimes approach a fairly professional register, depending on context, audience, and purpose. Always imagine the readers before choosing the language. If the readers are other teenagers, contractions, occasional conversational expressions, and a lively tone may be highly appropriate. If the audience includes parents, teachers, or members of the wider community, use a slightly more controlled style. If you are contributing to an environmental, cultural, travel, scientific, or professional blog, specialist vocabulary may be appropriate. Although you should still write accessibly enough for the intended readership, audience also affects what you explain. Imagine that you are writing about artificial intelligence for students at your school. You probably do not need to define artificial intelligence in the opening paragraph, but if you introduce a less familiar technical concept, explain it naturally, rather than assuming that every reader has specialist knowledge. Remember that sophisticated writing is not writing that deliberately makes comprehension difficult. Criterion A rewards language that enhances communication. At the highest level, vocabulary should be nuanced and varied, and grammatical structures should be used selectively and effectively. The word selectively is crucial. Do not force complicated grammar into every sentence. You are not trying to prove that you memorized 20 structures. You are trying to use language as a skilled writer would use it. Compare these sentences. Volunteering was good. I learned many things. I met different people. It changed my opinion. The meaning is understandable, but the language is basic and repetitive. Now compare. Although I had originally regarded volunteering as little more than an obligation to complete, meeting people whose experiences were completely different from mine forced me to reconsider what meaningful community involvement actually looks like. The second sentence uses subordination, precise vocabulary, and a more sophisticated conceptual relationship. You can create grammatical range naturally through relative clauses, conditionals, participle clauses, modal verbs, passive structures, varied sentence openings, and different sentence lengths. For example, having spent years complaining that someone should do something, I finally realized that someone could be me. If every student donated just 2 hours each term, the cumulative impact could be enormous. The project, which initially attracted fewer than 20 volunteers, eventually involved more than 80 students. What surprised me most was not how much help the community needed, but how much we gained by providing it. Rarely had I considered how isolating everyday life could become for someone living alone. Notice that the structures serve the message. Idiomatic language can also strengthen a blog because it can make the voice sound natural. For a suitable audience, expressions such as, "It opened my eyes, we took it for granted." That was the turning point. The idea caught on. We were only scratching the surface. It is easier said than done. Or the experience stayed with me can sound natural. But idioms should be purposeful. Filling a paragraph with memorized expressions makes writing sound artificial rather than sophisticated. The same warning applies to slang. A blog for young people may contain some informal vocabulary, but an IB examination response should not resemble a stream of text messages. Writing something like, "OMG, guys, this volunteering thing was literally insane. You have to try it," does not demonstrate strong audience control merely because teenagers are the intended readers. Natural informality is different from careless writing. Now let us work through another original Paper One style prompt. After noticing how much food is wasted every day in your school cafeteria, you joined a student project attempting to reduce the problem. You want the wider school community to understand what you discovered. Write a text in which you describe the scale of the problem, explain what your group has already done, and encourage members of the school community to change one habit. Begin with context, audience, and purpose. The context is a student food waste project. The audience is the wider school community. The purposes are to inform, explain, and persuade. A blog is highly appropriate because the writer is sharing an experience and ideas with a broad community readership and wants readers to respond personally. Now plan around the three actions. First, describe the scale of the problem. Second, explain what the group has done. Third, encourage readers to change one habit. Do not simply write whatever you know about food waste. Your content must answer those exact requirements. A strong title might be, "What Our Lunch Bins Taught Us About Waste." The opening might be, "Last Tuesday, our environmental group did something rather unpleasant. We spent lunchtime examining what everyone else had thrown away. By the end of the hour, the result was impossible to dismiss. Sandwiches, unopened fruit, untouched side dishes, and countless half-finished meals had filled several large containers." We often talk about sustainability in ambitious terms, but perhaps the most revealing environmental lesson in our school has been sitting inside a rubbish bin. Notice how the introduction gives the blog a personal voice while immediately serving the prompt. Then the second section could explain what the group did. Instead of beginning with a complicated campaign, we tested 3 simple changes. Students could request smaller portions. Unopened packaged food could be placed on a sharing table, and signs beside the bins reminded everyone to take only what they expected to eat. None of these ideas was revolutionary. That was precisely the point. Within a week, however, noticeably less edible food was being discarded. Then the persuasive section might say, "So here is my challenge for this week. Take less first. You can always return for more." It sounds almost embarrassingly simple, but hundreds of small decisions made every lunchtime add up quickly. Sustainability does not begin with impressive promises. It begins with ordinary habits repeated consistently. And the ending could return directly to the readers. Next time you stand in the cafeteria queue, look at your tray before automatically adding another item. Will you actually eat it? If enough of us ask that one question, our bins may start telling a very different story. What change would you add to the campaign? That last question serves a genuine blog purpose. It invites interaction. However, do not believe that every blog must finish with exactly the words, "What do you think? Leave a comment below." That phrase has become a formula. Sometimes it works. Sometimes a better ending is a challenge. Try one screen-free evening this week and see what you notice. Sometimes it is a recommendation. If you have been considering volunteering, stop waiting for the perfect opportunity and start with one afternoon. Sometimes it returns to the opening. 3 days without my phone did not turn me into a digital minimalist. It did, however, teach me something more useful. I want to decide when I use technology instead of letting technology decide for me. And sometimes it asks a meaningful question. If convenience is costing us more than we realize, which habit are we willing to change first? The ending should fit the purpose. Now consider a different audience and a different IB-style task. During a visit to another country, you stayed with a local family rather than in a hotel. The experience challenged several assumptions you had made about the culture before arriving. You want to share the experience with young travelers interested in visiting the country. Write a text in which you describe one memorable experience with your host family. Explain how your understanding of the culture changed and give advice to future visitors. This is almost ideal territory for a blog. You have personal experience, reflection, advice, and a public audience interested in the subject. A title could be, "I thought I knew the culture until I lived with a local family." Or, "Skip the hotel? What a host family taught me about traveling." Your opening could be, "Before arriving, I thought I had done my research. I had watched documentaries, read travel guides, and memorized enough etiquette rules to avoid embarrassing myself. Or so I believed. 24 hours with my host family taught me that knowing facts about a culture and actually experiencing it are two very different things. Now the personal narration serves a larger purpose. Later you might develop the reflection. The most important lesson came during dinner. I had assumed that turning down more food was simply a matter of saying, "No, thank you." My hosts, however, continued offering dishes, and at first I interpreted their persistence as slightly uncomfortable. Only later did I understand that the repeated offers were expressions of generosity rather than pressure. Once I stopped measuring every interaction against the habits I was used to, the evening became far easier and far more interesting. Then translate the experience into advice. If you stay with a local family, learn the basic customs beforehand, but do not treat your research as a complete instruction manual. Observe. Ask respectful questions. Most importantly, resist the temptation to label every unfamiliar habit as strange simply because it differs from your own. Notice the maturity of the message. The blog does not merely narrate something amusing that happened abroad. It reflects on assumptions, cultural perspective, and behavior. That is the level of development you should aim for. Now let us consider a blog whose purpose is primarily argumentative rather than experiential. Here is another paper one style prompt. Many students at your school increasingly use artificial intelligence tools when studying. Some believe these tools improve learning, while others fear students are becoming dependent on them. The student website has invited contributions on the issue. Write a text in which you discuss one important benefit of these tools, examine one significant risk, and explain how students can use them responsibly. Blog set of instructions. Formal report. The blog allows you to combine analysis with a personal voice. A strong opening might be, ask 10 students whether they use artificial intelligence to study, and you may not get 10 honest answers, but you will almost certainly discover that the technology is already part of everyday school life. The interesting question is no longer whether students will use AI. It is how we can use it without allowing a useful tool to replace the thinking we are supposed to develop. This opening is less personal than the travel example, yet it remains recognizably blog-like because it directly addresses a contemporary readership and establishes a clear writer's voice. The benefit paragraph could develop one precise point rather than listing 5 superficial advantages. For example, used intelligently, AI can make feedback far more immediate. If I practice writing an introduction at 9 o'clock in the evening, I do not necessarily have to wait until the following lesson to identify obvious weaknesses. A tool can ask me whether my argument is clear, identify repetition, or generate questions that expose gaps in my reasoning. The crucial distinction, however, is between receiving feedback on thinking and outsourcing the thinking itself. Then develop the risk. That distinction is also where the biggest danger lies. The moment a student moves from, "Help me improve this idea," to "Produce the idea for me," efficiency begins replacing learning. A polished answer may appear impressive, but if the student cannot explain the reasoning behind it, very little education has actually taken place. Finally, offer a principle. My rule is simple. Use AI after thinking, not instead of thinking. Attempt the problem first. Form an opinion first. Write a rough paragraph first. Then use technology to question, test, or refine what you have produced. Again, strong blog writing depends on development. One benefit explored intelligently is often better than 4 benefits reduced to 1 sentence each. Criterion B is not a competition to include the maximum number of ideas. It rewards relevant ideas that are fully developed with detail and examples. That means your planning should be selective. Before writing, create a very quick task map. Suppose the question asks you to describe a problem, explain its consequences, and suggest ways readers can help. Write those 3 requirements in abbreviated form on your planning page. Problem, consequences, action. Then decide where each one will appear. This prevents one of the most damaging paper one mistakes, forgetting one part of the task. IB examiner guidance is particularly important here. If a question asks for 2 major elements and a response addresses only one, the message criterion can be severely limited, even if the writing itself is fluent. So underline command words. Describe, explain, discuss, evaluate, suggest, encourage, reflect, compare, recommend. These verbs tell you what the content must actually do. Describe requires concrete information. Explain requires reasons and relationships. Discuss normally requires exploration rather than a one-sided declaration. Suggest requires realistic proposals. Encourage means the writing must actually become persuasive. Reflect means moving beyond events to their significance. If a prompt says, "Describe the experience," explain what you learned, and encourage others to participate. Do not turn all 3 into description. Narrating the entire event in chronological detail may produce an entertaining story, but still fail the task. The event should become evidence for the ideas. Another important blog feature is direct engagement with the reader. You can achieve this through second-person pronouns. You may think one person's choices make little difference. Through inclusive pronouns, we are all responsible for the culture we create at school. Through questions, when did convenience become more important than connection? Through challenges, for 1 week, try carrying a reusable bottle and notice how often you would otherwise have bought plastic. Through shared assumptions, most of us have probably complained that we are too busy to volunteer. And through anticipation of objections. You might argue that avoiding fast fashion is unrealistic for students on limited budgets, and that is a fair concern. That final technique is particularly powerful because it creates the impression of genuine dialogue with readers. But reader engagement should not become mechanical. A paragraph containing 5 rhetorical questions in succession usually sounds artificial. Use rhetorical features when they help the communication. The same applies to exclamation marks. One well-placed exclamation mark may suit an enthusiastic travel or lifestyle blog. 10 of them will rarely improve your mark. Another area to control carefully is paragraphing. Blogs often use relatively short paragraphs because they are designed for online reading. In an examination, however, do not reduce every sentence to its own paragraph merely to imitate a website. Your paragraphs should still represent developed units of thought. A useful body paragraph often has an internal movement, main idea, development, specific example, reflection or implication, and transition. For example, The campaign also exposed a problem none of us had expected. Many students misunderstood what could actually be recycled. Labels such as compostable and biodegradable sounded environmentally friendly, but that did not necessarily mean the items belonged in our school recycling bins. After speaking to the facilities team, we replaced vague posters with photographs showing exactly where common lunch items should go. Within days, contamination in the recycling containers had noticeably fallen. Sometimes environmental progress depends less on convincing people to care and more on making the correct action clear. That paragraph develops one coherent idea, from problem to solution to broader insight. This is much stronger than, recycling is important. Students make mistakes. We made posters. The posters helped. Everyone should recycle. Now consider cohesion across the entire response. Criterion B values logical and coherent organization. Use transitions that show relationships between ideas, rather than simply numbering them. Avoid repeatedly writing, firstly, secondly, thirdly, finally. Those expressions are not incorrect, but constant dependence on them can make sophisticated ideas sound like a basic classroom essay. Instead, use meaningful transitions. What surprised me even more was that experience led to another realization. The problem, however, goes beyond. There is another side to the argument? This sounds encouraging, but there is one major obstacle. The simplest solution may also be the most effective. Looking back, I now realize, for readers considering the same experience, the point is not that. What matters more is, these transitions communicate logic, not just order. Your vocabulary should also respond to the theme. If the topic concerns sustainability, consider precise language such as consumption, disposable, wasteful, resources, environmental impact, long-term consequences, sustainable alternatives, individual responsibility, collective action, and behavioral change. If the topic concerns technology, dependency, digital literacy, privacy, algorithm, automation, accessibility, efficiency, critical thinking, misinformation, ethical use. If the topic concerns social organization or community, participation, inclusion, social isolation, access, voluntary work, community engagement, initiative, inequality, shared responsibility. Do not memorize impressive words independently of meaning. Build thematic vocabulary in groups so that you can use it naturally. Equally important is nuance. Compare. Social media is bad for teenagers. With constant exposure to carefully curated online lives can distort young people's expectations of what ordinary life should look like. The second sentence communicates a more precise idea. Compare. Volunteering helps people. With regular volunteering can strengthen communities while also challenging the assumptions volunteers themselves bring to the experience. Again, precision creates sophistication. Now let us discuss the visual conventions of a blog. A clear title is highly advisable. You may include a byline or date if it fits naturally. You may also use occasional subheadings, particularly if the subject is informational or advice-based. For example, what we discovered. Why it matters what you can do, but do not turn your response into a collection of fragments. The visible layout matters, but the deeper conventions matter more. A recognizable writer's voice, awareness of readers, an appropriate public tone, clear paragraphing, and an ending that creates a sense of completion or interaction. Do not waste examination time drawing website logos, menus, sidebars, profile photographs, like buttons, or elaborate comment boxes. You are being assessed as a writer, not as a web designer. Likewise, hashtags do not magically transform an article into a blog. Neither does writing. Comments, 0 likes, 54 share at the bottom of the page. Those are superficial signals. The text itself must behave like a blog. One of the best tests is this. If the title and visual formatting disappeared, would the examiner still recognize a blogger speaking to an online readership? If the answer is yes, your conceptual understanding is probably much stronger. Let us now look at several common mistakes. The first is writing an essay disguised as a blog. This usually begins, "In this blog, I am going to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of volunteering." Then follows, "Firstly," "Secondly," "On the other hand," "In conclusion." Nothing about those expressions is grammatically wrong, but the response lacks a convincing relationship with a real readership. A stronger opening would be, "A month ago, I thought volunteering was something people did because it looked good on applications. One Saturday at a community center was enough to prove how badly I had misunderstood it." The second mistake is writing a diary instead of a blog. If most sentences simply narrate private feelings with no awareness of readers, the response may drift towards diary writing. Keep asking, "Why would my audience care? What does this experience mean for them?" The third mistake is excessive informality. Contractions are fine in many blogs. Conversational phrases can be fine. Humor can be excellent. But accuracy, clarity, and sophistication still matter. The fourth mistake is generic content. Suppose the question asks about reducing car use in your town. Writing, "Pollution is a big problem everywhere. We must save the environment. Everyone should help the earth," communicates almost nothing specific. Instead, for journeys of less than 2 kilometers, many residents still automatically reach for their car keys. That habit may appear insignificant individually, but multiplied across hundreds of households twice a day, it becomes a major source of avoidable traffic and emissions. Specificity creates development. The fifth mistake is treating the 3 requirements of the prompt as 3 completely disconnected mini-essays. Your response should feel unified. An excellent blog develops a central line of thought. For example, "I experienced the problem. The experience changed my understanding. That understanding is why I am asking you to act." Those 3 stages form one communicative journey. The sixth mistake is forgetting the audience halfway through. A response may begin, "Fellow students, have you noticed how much plastic we use?" Then suddenly become, "Government authorities must implement comprehensive national legislation governing industrial production." The argument has drifted away from what the readers can realistically understand or influence. Keep the audience active throughout. Ask what they know. Ask what they care about. Ask what they can realistically do. Now let us translate all of this directly into the assessment criteria. For criterion A, language, aim for accurate and varied language that improves the message. Use precise thematic vocabulary. Vary grammatical structures naturally. Include complex structures where they help you express complex ideas. Use idiomatic language selectively. Avoid repetition, and leave enough time to correct errors that interfere with communication. For criterion B, message, fulfill every part of the task. Stay relevant. Develop your ideas rather than merely listing them. Support claims with details, examples, observations, or plausible experiences. Organize the response so that one idea leads logically to the next. And remember that a beautifully written paragraph that does not help answer the task is consuming valuable words. For criterion C, conceptual understanding, make sure the blog is appropriate to the context, purpose, and audience. Maintain a suitable register and tone. Use recognizable blog conventions. Create a convincing writer-reader relationship. And make the response feel as though it genuinely belongs in the situation described by the prompt. This is why audience is not an extra feature added after writing. Audience affects everything: your title, your opening, your vocabulary, your examples, your level of explanation, your humor, your degree of formality, your persuasive strategies, and your ending. Now consider the same basic message written for 3 different blog audiences. The core idea is encouraging people to spend less time online. For teenage readers, I used to insist that checking my phone before bed helped me relax. Then I looked at my screen time report. Apparently, relaxing involved losing almost 2 hours every night to videos I could barely remember the next morning. For parents and members of a school community, conversations about teenagers and screen time often become arguments about discipline. My own experience suggests that the issue may be more complicated. The problem was not that I consciously chose to spend hours online. It was how rarely I noticed I was doing it. For readers of a technology and well-being blog, digital habits are difficult to change, partly because many of them are not experienced as deliberate decisions. During a week-long experiment with app limits, I became far more aware of how frequently I reached for my phone without any clear purpose. The subject is identical. The language changes because the audience changes. That flexibility is exactly what successful Paper 1 writing requires. During the examination, spend the first part of your time planning rather than immediately writing. A practical strategy might be approximately 10 minutes for choosing and analyzing the task and outlining your response, around 65 to 70 minutes for drafting, and the remaining time for revision. This is not an official IB timetable. Adapt it to your own writing speed, but do not sacrifice revision completely. At higher level, a strong target is usually somewhere safely within the prescribed 450 to 600 word range, rather than trying to reach exactly 600 words. Something around 500 to 550 words often gives enough room for development, while leaving space for control and revision. Before you finish, perform 3 separate checks. First, check the task. Have I answered every required action? If the prompt says describe, explain, and recommend, locate the evidence for all 3. Second, check the blog. Is there an engaging title? Is the writer's voice recognizable? Do I address or acknowledge my readers? Does the tone match them? Does the closing feel like the ending of a public online post rather than an academic essay? Third, check the language. Look for repeated vocabulary. Check subject-verb agreement. Check verb tense consistency. Check articles. Check pronouns. Check sentence boundaries. Check prepositions. And examine your longest sentences carefully. Complexity only earns its place if the sentence remains controlled. There is one final principle worth remembering. Do not memorize one universal blog and attempt to reshape every question around it. Memorize the logic of the text type instead. A blog has a writer. That writer has a reason for posting. The post has readers. Those readers have particular expectations, knowledge, and interests. The writer establishes a relationship with them. The ideas develop towards a purpose, and the ending gives readers something to think about, respond to, or do. When all of those elements work together, the blog stops looking like an examination exercise with a title pasted onto it. It begins to feel like genuine communication. So when you see blog among your Paper 1 options, do not immediately ask, what format have I memorized? Ask better questions. Why am I writing this? Who is reading it? Why should they care? What exactly has the question asked me to accomplish? What personal voice suits this situation? What examples will make my ideas convincing? And what do I want readers to think, feel, or do when they reach the final sentence? Answer those questions well, and the structure becomes much easier. Choose the blog when its public, personal, and interactive nature genuinely serves the situation. Build a clear relationship with the audience. Fulfill every element of the prompt. Develop a small number of strong ideas with detail and reflection. Use sophisticated language, because it improves meaning, not because it looks impressive. And make every feature from the title to the final line contribute to the purpose of the text. That is how you turn a simple blog post into a high-level Paper 1 response.